Jon Taylor, Taylor. I'm professor of political science. I'm also chair of the Department of Political Science and Geography at UT San Antonio.
All right, wonderful. So, my first question is, we from 2 o'clock this morning onward, we have been getting hit with a nonstop stream of everything that's happened.
Oh
Can
yeah.
you give me kind of your rough timeline as you know it for how things have gone down, how this has developed? You can go as far back as you want to, or
Sure.
you can be as concise as you want to.
We can go back 10 years, but we won't do that. I mean, because we can talk about the Maduro regime coming to power after the passing of Hugo Chavez. And then fights and issues over election irregularities that took place twice. You have a president who basically was prevented from being on the ballot, who likely won the last presidential election. So there was questions about a stolen election. There are questions about connections to narco terrorism and narco trafficking. In general, just instability in the region. President Trump claims there are issues related to people that have been released from asylums that have made their way to the United States. And so we've had the situation with Venezuela for a good decade or more. Venezuela's allies are our adversaries. Let's be honest here. They are China, Russia, Cuba, among others, and Iran. And so it is within the scope of what we've seen in terms of opposition that the United States has at least talked about the idea of regime change. It's not just under Trump. They didn't do it as much under Biden, but there was even talk there about trying to discourage and destabilize the regime. So all this in context, in the last roughly 4 or 5 months, there have been negotiations between Maduro and Trump over oil, in particular, oil and rare earth minerals specifically, to try to provide for greater American access. That seems to have broken down, obviously, in what happened today. What's interesting is that the indictments as they're put forth are similar to the indictments that were put forward for a former Honduran president who President Trump eventually pardoned. And so there's some questions about what exactly is going on here. One of the charges actually relates back to the Handgun Act of 1934, or Firearms Act of 1934, which is like, wait a minute, Maduro is not an American citizen, other than talking about the possibility of smuggling arms in the United States. Trump has made the claim that this is, that Venezuela has encouraged terrorism and that this is basically fighting a war on terrorism. And so that's kind of the context which led to the situation today. Prefacing all this, I should note that irrespective of either side, the military did a brilliant job of going in and capturing, apprehending, and bringing Maduro to the USS Iwo Jima with no loss of life, at least on our side. We don't know on the other side. Presumably, there will be reports of loss of life. Now the question is, what happens next? And I think this is where it gets really concerning, is that we saw the president, we saw members of the cabinet plus the general that was in charge of the operation. And in particular, President Trump talked at length about oil and talked at length about wealth and resources. He didn't mention much about democracy, restoring Venezuelan democracy. He, in fact, dismissed out of hand um, the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize just a few months ago, arguing that she's unqualified to be president. Additionally, the actual Venezuelan vice president, she's in Russia and was sworn in as president. And Trump today said something to the effect of that they've been in communication with her and are, quote, negotiating. Who knows? But when you have a president who's then turning around and saying that we're going to run Venezuela, we're going to manage their resources, it reminds me an awful lot of 20 years ago, unfortunately, and Iraq. And that's naturally what's come out with both Republicans and Democrats alike who have complained about this operation. Members of Congress, in particular, U.S. Senate members, have noted that both Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth appeared before committees and said that they would not go forward with this sort of stuff, that they would not engage in this action, and yet here we are today.
Absolutely. We have touched on a lot there. It touched on a lot of questions that I
Sure.
had lined up. So
Oh,
perfect.
good.
I guess let's just jump right into the big one.
Okay.
The Of course, we've seen these targeted strikes on military locations.
Sure.
We've heard some, reports not necessarily confirmed by U.S. Media houses, but some reports of potential civilian
Right.
casualties. We don't know the number of Venezuelan armed forces who were lost in this very swift
Right.
assault. I wanted to know, so given the region, given the political situation and how it's gone for the
Yeah.
past several years, do you think that we are going to see a prolonged military action and presence in the region?
From what the president said, the answer is yes. He tried to hem and haw a bit on it, but to be blunt, you only have 15,000 troops that are available, at least with the carrier task force in the Caribbean. If you're going to engage in essentially what is regime change and try to affect a regime change, you're going to have a lot more boots on the ground, as it were, than just a small force. This is why, again, there's concerns about where is this going and how much planning was involved here. This is where I would make the argument where Congress needed to be involved. Yeah, you don't. Okay, we've seen it, and this is not just with Trump. You can make the same claim with Obama, with Biden, back to Bush, even, in which often presidents would not inform Congress until actions were taking place, and often just the leadership of Congress. And so, in fact, Trump kind of alluded to that this press conference, arguing that, Congress leaks. Okay, all well and fine. But there's something to be said for consulting Congress in what you're going to do in day one after you've done this, when you've tried to affect regime change. Where are we going forward with this, and how are we going forward? Who's in charge? Trump says that he's in charge, or the U.S. is in charge. Okay, then who exactly is that person that's going to be named? How are they going to work with the Venezuelan government? Keep in mind, the Venezuelan government is still a Bolivarian republic in which you have a number of regime members, hardcore regime members still in place. How do you work with them? I think it feels like, in some respects, this was not thought out well, other than just to get Maduro.
No, I completely understand that. We've seen some reports of course, we've seen various, partner nations of Venezuela
Sure.
condemn the operation. We have also seen some initial reports that Colombia would be inclined to support whatever operation or whatever defense of Venezuela that those that are, currently,
Right.
were either appointed or elected under Maduro and the Maduro government and remain loyal to Maduro. And now, I guess it would be the defense minister of Venezuela as well as the sitting vice president that's now acting as president. Um, do you think that the United States would be willing to get into a protracted armed conflict with multiple nations in the theater?
Lord, let's hope not, because I mean, Trump made a threat toward President Petro, the president of Colombia, this morning, arguing that you better watch it or you're next. President Scheinbaum in Mexico basically condemned the attack, and essentially Trump kind of said the same thing about Mexico. Brazil has also condemned the attack. So you're talking about big time neighbors who are involved with this. I don't think you want this kind of conflict or this kind of escalation to take place. Trump also, of course, mentioned Cuba, which is near and dear to Secretary Rubio. And so you've got a situation where you start thinking about, okay, how many potential conflicts or engagements are we talking about here? Particularly for a president who said that he was going to be elected to have no more wars. And here we are. It's kind of, there's a discontinuity here, obviously. What's interesting is to note some of Venezuela's allies. One in particular we should note here, and that is China. China had a special envoy sent by President Xi Jinping in the last couple of days, who in fact met with Maduro yesterday morning and had a nice press conference, exchanged gifts, talked about China's long-lasting relationship with the Maduro regime. And then just hours later, the U.S. is attacking Caracas. And so the Chinese, what surprise, went crazy. Their Ministry of Foreign Affairs directly condemned the United States, argued that basically it was a form of American hegemony and all this. The worry is this, is that what we did here in terms of trying to engage in regime change in terms of literally grabbing an elected leader is that it gives a green light potentially to Vladimir Putin regarding Ukraine and Xi Jinping regarding Taiwan. Not that it's never going to happen, but at least it makes it more difficult for the United States to condemn when we are engaging in activity that some view as similar to what the Russians have done and others have done.
Absolutely. Speaking of parallel events, I do want to go ahead and ask you about some similarities.
Sure.
One of the things that have come up in our newsroom specifically is talking about the parallels between this as well as Panama and
Right.
Noriega in the 1980s. So can you would you be able to break down the
Oh, sure.
parallels there and what commonalities you're seeing and what differences?
Sure. There are a few commonalities. One is that, is that Manuel Noriega was essentially a narcotics trafficker, one of the biggest in Central America. One of the, although I would say, and yes, we actually did engage in an Operation Just Cause in 1989 to apprehend Noriega. Eventually, it took days to do it. And the difference, though, I think is stark here because unlike Venezuela, where we have no real assets, where we have no, any sort of military presence, that was not the case in Panama in 1989 with the Panama Canal, with American presence that was there. It made in a country that's much, much smaller. The operation was, in that respect, a much, no operation is easy, obviously, military operation, but nonetheless, it was relatively easy to do this in Venezuela. Yeah, it was a surgical strike and it was quick, and they found Maduro very quickly, but he was asleep, by the way, so it made it easier. They were definitely not prepared for an attack. But long term, in the case of Panama, as in the case of Venezuela, you don't know what's going to happen in the sense of what the political structure will be, what the reaction will be, how Venezuelans will react is going to be interesting because you do have Venezuelans who are adamantly opposed to the regime. In fact, they live here in San Antonio, among other places. In fact, I have some who are students who are cautiously optimistic today about what's going on, but also concerned about the situation and what might take place. There are others who are adamantly opposed to the invasion, who are supporters of Maduro and the Bolivarian, republic approach. And so I worry that we may be in a situation where we may destabilize Venezuela because of the political potential for political conflict. That not that Venezuela wasn't unstable to begin with, it was. And in fact, what's interesting is that the country, as it moved from Hugo Chavez into Maduro, it also devolved into much more a kleptocracy. And that is where it began to lose at least support among average people, other than those in the lower income classes, who, by the way, continue to support Maduro and the regime because they were viewed basically as being rewarded by the regime. That was not the case for middle class and upper middle class Venezuelans. And so again, I worry about where we're going and has it been well thought out here? And I just based on what I'm seeing so far, it doesn't seem like it was well thought out in terms of day one and beyond.
No, I completely understand what you're saying there. Another parallel I want to draw is we did talk about a formerly pardoned head of Honduras, I believe it
Yes.
was. Can you go ahead and give me a little bit more context on that, as
Oh,
well
sure.
as kind of the pardoning deal with the previous Trump administration?
He was indicted by the United States, by the Justice Department, on massive drug trafficking charges. He was indicted, convicted, in fact, in the same federal court where Maduro will be in the next day or so. However, Trump believed that the then president was given a raw deal, that it was actually a sham what went on, that it was his political opponents that set him up. And so the result was when Trump came back to power, he was pardoned by Trump. on charges which ironically are very similar, if not parallel, to what Maduro is currently facing.
So I guess the another parallel that I want to ask about, I think this should be the last parallel that I'm going to ask about is we, of course, in the previous weeks, the Trump administration did deem fentanyl to be a weapon of mass destruction.
Right.
Of course, we, remember from the war in Iraq that, Saddam Hussein allegedly had weapons of mass destruction. That was ultimately proven to be not the case. What do you have to say to that parallel? Is this kind of a similar deal? What role does Venezuela play in fentanyl production and trafficking?
Venezuela does not play much, if any, role in fentanyl. That is more of a case of, well, let's be blunt, China through Mexico, rather than necessarily Venezuela. In fact, Venezuela, what you're seeing more is more marijuana than anything else. In the case and next door in Colombia, it was cocaine for years, but even then, cocaine, excuse me, fentanyl does not have the same kind of impact from Colombia as it does from other places. And so, I mean, could we make the parallel that this is like Colin Powell sitting in front of the Security Council regarding Iraq and weapons of mass destruction? Maybe. I guess we'll see as we go forward. They're again, they're going to have to really detail the charges against Maduro and really link and show true substantial proof that Maduro was somehow involved in some sort of massive fentanyl trafficking to the United States. There doesn't seem to be that link so far. So, you're going to have to prove that. You just simply are.
Gotcha. I fully understand that. Bringing it more local, we have, with all of the discussion of drug trafficking connected to Venezuela, we hear a lot about Tren de Aragua.
Oh yeah.
Um, do you think that this operation will have any impact on their operations or the so-called Carteles del Sol or the broader alleged narco trafficking organization?
I mean, the president mentioned it this morning. In fact, he kind of rambled on talking about Aspen, Colorado, excuse me, about Aurora, Colorado again and Tren de Aragua. We'll see. Um, TDA seems to have been at least somewhat tamped down by efforts, at least in the last year or so. It's not completely gone by any stretch. I mean, even Governor Abbott declared them a terrorist organization at one point, or a narco-terrorist organization at one point. And they have been very aggressive, as has SAPD, in going after them. That said, it's one of these things, again, it's an open question. We'll see what happens going forward. The worry I would have is that TDA, among others, and not just them, but just in general, regime members, you want to cause havoc. You cause havoc against the country that basically attempted to remove and tried to basically overthrow you by throwing all sorts of asymmetrical warfare, as it were, against the United States. And again, drug trafficking would be one. The use of assets within the United States to cause chaos and trouble, possibilities there. This is again where our our national intelligence apparatus, national security apparatus, cybersecurity apparatus all come into play to try to deal with and address these threats. Not that you can stop everything, but in general, Venezuela was not the threat in terms of a direct national security threat that the Trump administration, I think, painted at times. I mean, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, you could call fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction, but if you're going to do that, you might want to label that with other countries as well. We didn't. And until we do that, and then you're going to raise the stakes big time when you do that, it would suggest to me that this was used as a pretext, politically, a pretext to, yes, to affect regime change. And we can debate whether the good and bad points of regime change till the cows come home. In fact, this coming spring, my class is on democracy and global politics, and guess what? We will be doing exactly that.
A lot to cover in that class. I would
Oh
love to sit in
yeah.
on that. Um, I guess one other thing
Okay.
I did want to ask about, on sort of an international scope,
Sure.
um, I was quite frankly stunned that the president would speak so candidly about the role of oil in
Yeah.
all of this. Um, is there any pretext for that? Has there been any like is there any precedent for this? Is this have we done anything like this before?
I mean, some would argue we did that in Iraq. However, we weren't quite so in your face about it. And so this was a little bit shocking to hear him say this today, because it essentially gives credence to opponents saying this is a war for oil. And if you're going to do that, now you've got to justify why and how. What does he say? He talks about we're going to extract the oil, we're going to give it to the people of Venezuela, and they took a while to get there. Now, if you're going to flood the market with cheap Venezuelan oil, this directly impacts Texas and not in a good way. Price of oil is already below what we would want for the state of Texas when it comes to our revenues. Now, all of a sudden, if we're getting cheap Venezuelan oil, instead of West Texas Intermediate being at roughly $58 a barrel, it drops to $38 a barrel. That's not good news for the state of Texas financially. And so there are trade-offs, good and bad trade-offs here with this, and this is one that I don't think Texans may not be aware of necessarily yet, is that it could seriously impact the state of Texas financially if we are flooded with cheap oil.
No, absolutely. That definitely is a concern. Another local concern, of course, because we keep having it discussed year after year, especially
Sure.
with Operation Lone Star and the Texas governor and deploying the National Guard at the southern border. We hear a lot about the ongoing immigration crisis
Right.
and the role that Venezuela has played in that. Do you think that this conflict is going to lead to a spike in immigration?
I think you will see a flood of migrants crossing the border, particularly into Colombia, which means you're going to end up with a humanitarian crisis there. As people attempt to cross from Colombia through Central America, it is quite possible we could see a spike, quite possible. We'll see what happens there. It's also possible that if the regime is stabilized and becomes more U.S. friendly, that Venezuelans currently in the United States may decide the situation is better because many of them fled Venezuela, not just for political purposes, for economic purposes. They may decide, you know what, the time might be right to go back. We don't know. This is, again, one of these completely kind of what are called black swan events. We don't know where we're going to go with this and where it's going to lead, let alone a month from now or 5 years from now.
Absolutely. I guess the big local question
Sure.
is how is this going to affect the Venezuelan diaspora that is currently in San Antonio and all throughout the
Sure.
country?
At least the Venezuelan diaspora here in San Antonio and in Texas are likely at least cautiously optimistic, as some of my students have told me. They're cautiously optimistic, but they're also wary about what's going on, the fact that the situation is not stable, that we seem to still have left what was the remnants of the Maduro regime in power, the Bolivarians basically in power. So there is a question about, when can you actually, go home again, as it were. Who knows? It's not going to happen anytime soon. If you're going to try to completely change Venezuela's political structure, which, by the way, is pretty enhanced. That is not a short-term thing. Much like what took place in Iraq, it took years, and even then we failed miserably at the task. And I'm worried that the same thing could take place here, is that we could attempt to work with at least elements of the Venezuelan regime that remains, and yet at the same time still not affect what we would think would be proper reforms to restore at least a form of liberal democracy to Venezuela.
Absolutely. And speaking of that regime change, of course, we've seen, let me go ahead and pull up the other
Sure.
person's name here just to make sure that I've got all of my I's dotted and T's crossed. So, of course, we do have now long-standing history of, hesitancy over the Maduro, post Hugo Chavez,
Sure.
presidency. Of course, we had Juan Guaido, I believe I'm pronouncing
Right.
that right the
Guido.
first time, and now
Right.
we've got Maria Machado,
Yeah. Machado,
who has.
who's the Nobel Prize winner from 2025.
Yes, absolutely. Do you think that the United States stands to attempt to implement one of them as an acting president? Or do you think that the United States is not so bold as to do anything like that, but will
Right.
keep the current acting vice president and try to entertain negotiations? How deep do you think that this regime change is going to go?
I'd be very concerned if we tried to impose somebody, and not with all due respect to Machado, I would be very concerned to try to impose somebody like that on Venezuelans, simply because, again, that person who's not that popular to begin with would be viewed as a puppet of the United States. You need to be able to have somebody that you can work with, that serves essentially as an intermediary between us and the Venezuelans. And that is likely, at least at the moment, is likely the vice president who's now the acting president. But let's also not forget that the regime has a very strong national, basically a security apparatus that's in place. It's a form of a secret police that's in play, which is a very strong element in maintaining essentially Maduro and Chavez-like power. And so I don't know where we're going to go with this because again, I don't think you can do what you did in 2003, 2005, especially in Iraq, where we named somebody specifically as essentially to act as the U.S. administrator for Iraq. I cannot imagine us trying to repeat that effort in Venezuela. And if we do, I think we're going to need to consult the ghost of Dick Cheney to remind us about the problems that occurred with that.
Absolutely. And I guess one question that I had in my mind about prior events,
Ah,
of course, we've seen, especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, kind of a switch from and especially, going back, to the U.S. and Afghanistan, the U.S. and Iraq, the U.S. and Vietnam. There's a lot of areas where you can look and see that, oh, okay, well, instead of a conventional armed conflict between armies, it kind of devolves into asymmetric warfare,
right.
lots of guerrilla fighting and new means of fighting. Of course, we've seen, the rise of drones in the Ukrainian conflict,
Sure.
uh, that have taken that entire area by storm. Um, and one thing that I have seen in my research is a lot of civilians having been deputized into these kind of community militias. If the United States were to try to cement their foothold and go and enact a second wave of troops and military activity, do you think that this could devolve into a full-blown asymmetric conflict?
It absolutely could. And I think the concern we should have here is because the United States has not been very successful at nation building. It just hasn't. And so to think that somehow we're going to just step in quickly, solve the situation and leave, I think is a little bit naive. And the worry is that South America has a history of long-term guerrilla conflicts, insurgency movements, and it's not just, and Venezuela, in fact, had one only until a few years ago. Next door in Colombia, there was a long-term one. In Peru, for goodness sakes, there was a 20-year conflict between a Maoist terrorist organization and the government. And so to think that somehow you're not going to see insurgency rise, and therefore all of a sudden with asymmetrical warfare, with unconventional forces in play, it is possible that could happen, particularly with the remnants of the Maduro regime. I hope it doesn't. Let's hope it doesn't, but it's possible it could. And we need to be aware of that and prepared for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I really
You bet.
appreciate it. Stick around just a little bit after I end the
No problem.
recording. I want to make sure that I can go ahead and ask like one or two more questions
No
just
problem.
off of the thing. Let me go ahead and